In this podcast, we're going to be discussing the principles of endurance training. That could mean any number of things, but for the purpose of this podcast, we're going to be looking at understanding aspects that are really important to exercise training. So what are the principles of exercise training? It's about understanding what is really important to endurance fitness adaptation. And there are many things reported in the popular press. You could look at the types of training, cross-training techniques, things like strength training, technique training, the periodization of the program, so how much training you're doing, what type of training you're doing through different months, weeks of the year. Training intensity is really important. High intensity, low intensity, threshold intensity, the supplements that one could be using, even tapering. So endurance training components are really multifaceted, but we're going to look at the real ones that are important. In order to understand them, you need to be able to measure them. If something's really important to you, I would suggest measuring it. Otherwise, how else are you going to have a really thorough understanding of what it constitutes? When we measure them, you can measure output. So in cycling, it can be things like power. Running, it could be pace. Swimming, it could be speed. These are output measures, what happens as a result of your exercise. Input refers to intake of certain variables, things like oxygen consumption, or even measuring heart rate, how hard internally your body is working, even lactic acid. So we're going to be looking at concepts of output and concepts of input in order to better understand these concepts. This next slide by Celia is a hierarchy of endurance training needs, adapted from Maslow's hierarchy of psychological needs. In Maslow's hierarchy of psychological needs, towards the bottom of the pyramid, you would have things like survival, safety. Psychologically, if you don't feel like you can survive, if you don't feel safe, then nothing else really above that is important. So we're looking at these building blocks of endurance training needs. What is most important to the endurance athlete? And it's easy to get confused because there's so much information out there. Celia has an American researcher who's based in the Nordic region and has worked with a large range of endurance athletes. So is kind of well placed to give us an overview as to what might be important. In this hierarchy of needs, down the bottom you have total frequency and volume of training, high intensity training, the training intensity distribution, so training high intensively or low intensively. These three aspects Celia outlines as being well established. Above that you have aspects which are not as relevant but could have some benefit, providing these three down the bottom have been well groomed and well sought after in the general training diet. We're going to go over these three mainly. They're really important to endurance training success. These, it's like the icing on the cake. So we have a look at each one, starting from the bottom. Total frequency, volume of training, meaning how often and how much. So how often is the frequency? Often, we would say, and this is a big one. You just cannot beat consistency. So a quote I use with a lot of our athletes is, no matter how hard we push you in the next 6 months, it will pale in comparison to your strength in 3 years. That means time as a catalyst tends to prevail. You want to train well, you want to train hard, you want to train often. But time is a catalyst for improvement that just cannot be superseded. We're going to look at Hansell's adaptation curve, 1974 research project that came out with a general adaptation syndrome. We'll go on to that into the next slide, but that looks at some of this. Also, we look at how much. So more is more, or up until a point, and you need to find out what point is right for you. So a lot of endurance athletes are training 30 hours a week, the elite ones. For the bulk of us, that's just completely unattainable. So I would say to you that you do need to consider lifestyle factors such as family, work, and even play. So initially it might benefit you to sit down and say, well, what is my volume commitment each week? Can I commit to doing 4 hours of exercise a week? Can I commit to doing 8 hours of exercise a week? Consider lifestyle factors such as family, work, and play. Ideally, you do not want to create for yourself a long shot goal when it comes to volume. You want something that's attainable, because then you're meeting your own needs and you're feeling like a sense of accomplishment is achieved. So how often is how often you exercise? 5 days a week, 6 days a week, 2 days a week. Commit to that. How much? That's the total volume each week. What are you going to commit to? I'd write that down and set that up as a baseline for what comes next. That can be done in conjunction with people that you value, such as family, your partner, work associates, and others that you kick around with. Here is the General Adaptation Syndrome, or GAS, by Hans Sale, 1974. The 3 phases of the General Adaptation Syndrome you can see there. A is an alarm reaction phase, where your body tends to adjust to the training load initially, whatever it might be. B is a stage of resistance, and this is an adaptive stage. This is where adaptation tends to occur or is visible. C is an exhaustion phase, and that's where adaptation tends to drop away. It's important to have a general understanding of this syndrome because it is relevant to some of the building blocks in our hierarchy of endurance needs. So A, I would think, refers to how often you train. In order to prevent the alarm reaction phase, you need to train often. If you're only training intermittently, your body's constantly going to come up against the stressor of training. Training more often allows your body to get past that alarm reaction phase and into the stage of resistance or adaptation. The B phase also refers to volume. So you want to be training at a volume target that's normal for yourself. If it's 8 hours a week, 6 hours a week, once you hit that target, you're going to be able to spend more time in that B phase. C occurs if you push too hard in intensity or too much volume, and that will come rapidly. So a drop-off in fitness. So understand, by training often, you will overcome that initial alarm reaction phase every time you enter a stressful training environment. In B, volume each week, committing to 4 hours, 6 hours, 8 hours, whatever is sustainable for you, enables you to adapt to the training environment. So combining the frequency of training, as in how often, and the volume of training, being consistent across those two, and now enables you to develop a stage of resistance, of adaptation above the normal level. Any deviation from that and you could slip into C, which is a stage of exhaustion. So how do we piece this together? We have an understanding now that we need to train often, and we need to train with a volume target each week in mind. The next piece of the hierarchy is high intensity interval training. So how do you do that? Well, for a lot of people it's just going hard. And certainly that does constitute high intensity interval training, but is it the most effective way to train at a high intensity for endurance athletes? This graph in front of you is a graph of a VO2 max test. In this test, the individual may have completed a graded exercise test where they would start out at, say, 100 watts, Every 3 minutes it would increase by 35 watts. Another 3 minutes passes, another 35 watts. So a linear increase in resistance. It could be the same in a running test. They start out at 10 kilometers an hour for 3 minutes, then 11 kilometers an hour for 3 minutes, 12 kilometers an hour for 3 minutes, so on and so forth. A linear increase in resistance. But notice what happens internally for the body. We're looking at the amount of air that's brought in. We're also looking at the accumulation of lactic acid. What you'll notice is that these two variables have an exponential or a breakpoint related graph across a linear increase in resistance training. This is something that's best measured through a VO2 max assessment. Here we can outline the variables of VT1, the first ventilatory threshold, where the body's coasting along nicely and then all of a sudden there's a break point and the body starts to exercise more rapidly internally. Then it steps up again at the second ventilatory threshold around about here. So these break points identify different training intensities. Generally speaking, high intensity interval training can only be performed above this second ventilatory threshold. So at intensities for this individual of about 2.8 litres per minute and above. Training between the second ventilatory threshold and the first ventilatory threshold here, between 2.2 litres, 2.8 litres, is considered threshold training or moderate training. Low intensity training occurs from VT1 and below. So from a physiological perspective, there really might only be 3 training intensities: low, moderate between the two variables, and high. Often in Training Peaks and other databases, you may have 5 training zones, 6 training zones, even more. Physiologically, these are the markers that distinguish between the 3 major training zones. So it's important to understand that for every individual, in order to accelerate growth, you need to be training at above your VT2, the second ventilatory threshold, in order to get a bout of high intensity interval training. You can see internally that training at this point and above has a massive increase in lactic acid accumulation in the body. So it's a very, very potent stimulus for driving adaptation. But what does it all mean? We can't exactly go around with a VO2 measuring device on our back when we ride a bike or run or swim in the water. So we need to convert these measurements here in oxygen consumption to meaningful terms that we can apply in the real world. Completing high intensity interval training can only be done above VT2. That's the ventilation threshold number 2. The only way to measure this is by a VO2 test in cycling, in running and in swimming. But in order to then apply that data to the field, to when you're actually running, to when you're actually cycling or swimming, you have to measure the output, not just the oxygen or CO2 exchange, the input. This graph here is something that you can come up with. In this instance, oxygen increases rather linearly, and please understand that this is the same test that has been done here. Here we're looking at internal input measures, like minute ventilation or how much air you bring in, and here lactic acid accumulation across a graded exercise test that's linear in nature. This graph here just tracks oxygen consumption, so how much oxygen your body's pulling in as you increase across a linear increase in resistance in watts down the bottom here. So this is a cycling test. Understand that in this test, once you get about to 300 305 watts, oxygen consumption begins to plateau in this individual. The milliliters per kilogram per minute is around about 69. But at 305 watts, around about here, oxygen consumption plateaus. They could train at 320 watts here, or even 350 here, or 400. However, no further increase in oxygen consumption will occur. Now that's important because oxygen consumption is what drives adaptation in really acute settings. So by training it above the VT2, which for this individual may be around 85% of the figure here, so we're really looking at about 255 watts here and above. This is the optimal intensity for high intensity training. So understand that if we train them much harder than 300 watts, we're not going to get any further increase in oxygen consumption, but they're going to spend a shorter amount of time training there. So we can train this individual quite optimally at around about 305 watts to 255 watts and get a really large increase in oxygen consumption. That's high intensity interval training. So the VO2 test enables us to not only look at oxygen consumption, but the power output equivalent, meaning we can then prescribe to the individual, go out on your bike, ride for 5 minutes at a time at 270 watts in this instance, or 2 minutes at 300 watts, knowing that if we go above this point here, there is no further increase in oxygen consumption, and if we're below this point about here, then we're training at a threshold intensity between VT2 and VT1. All of this is outlined for every individual in a VO2 test. It is the most accurate way to outline these variables. So also understand that with high intensity interval training, you can train too hard. The VO2 max represents the upper limit of high intensity interval training. So in this individual here, they have their lactic threshold here, which could be their second ventilatory threshold equivalent. So for this individual, high intensity interval training really needs to occur on this running speed test somewhere between 8 miles per hour and maybe 11 miles per hour. Training them at 12 miles per hour, 13 miles per hour, 40 miles per hour, they would be able to do it for increasingly shorter periods per interval, but we're not getting any further increase in oxygen consumption. You begin to train anaerobically. So we can now spend, say, ask the athlete to do 3-minute efforts at 10 miles per hour. We could get them to do 7 of those. That's 21 minutes spent at close to the VO2 max. Or we could ask the individual to do 10 1-minute efforts at 14 miles per hour, somewhere up here. They would still have a similar VO2 max reading. However, they'd only accumulate 10 minutes across 10 1-minute efforts at this really high intensity. They'd felt like they'd had a workout, as opposed to the individuals who's trained at a lower intensity for a longer period of time, say 7 times 3 minutes efforts at this 10 miles per hour, and has accumulated 21 minutes at their VO2 max. Both would agree that they've had a very, very strenuous workout, yet one spent more time at their VO2 max. So if we're looking for endurance training adaptation, we need to be able to outline the ceiling of intensity and also the floor of intensity. And that's best done through a VO2 max assessment in your related discipline, be it rowing, be it swimming, be it cycling, be it cross-country skiing. Being able to measure that specifically then enables us to tailor high-intensity interval training to your physiology. So now we have an understanding that training often is important, how many times per week. The training volume per week is important. How much per week can you do? As a building block to endurance training, these two variables are really, really important. Another important building block is high intensity interval training, making sure you're training at a suitable intensity. The third building block of high importance, according to Seiler, is the training intensity distribution. So it's saying how much high intensity interval training should we do. There's a good evidence at the minute, for around 15 to 20% of your weekly volume as being about right for high intensity interval training. That's still quite a lot. Highly trained athletes need the remaining 80% at more low intensities, so beneath the first ventilatory threshold. For most people who are familiar with power readings, or FTP, functional threshold power tends to occur at around about this point here, or threshold running pace. So we're really talking about training at intensities well above that in high intensity, and training at intensities 10 or 15% below that as the absolute maximum for low intensities. Again, this can only really be outlined through a VO2 max test. Non-highly trained athletes can spend more time at threshold intensity, so between VT1 and VT2, and still adapt. There's something about highly trained athletes that they tend to begin to only really respond to exercise intensities above the second ventilatory threshold. They don't tend to adapt further training at intensities between here. Highly trained athletes in males is over 70 milliliters per kilogram per minute of a VO2 max. For women, somewhere over 60 milliliters per kilogram per minute as a rule of thumb. So if you feel like your training's stagnating, you may need to begin to look at high intensity interval training, because that does mean that you could potentially have hit your ceiling for what might be deemed as highly trained or non-highly trained. You can't go out every day and complete high intensity interval training. It's not practical or sustainable. So researchers looked at around 15 to 20% could be an appropriate stimulus to drive adaptation in most people. So we look now at how to measure VT1 and VT2, know your zones. As discussed, high intensity is above VT2, moderate intensity is between VT2 and VT1, low intensity is below VT1. So we can convert that to power once you've done a VO2 test, or running speed, or even swimming pace once the test has been done. The accuracy of the measurement is critical. It is our experience from measuring a lot of power meters on bikes at our facility in West Perth that the bulk of power meters appear to be inaccurate when measured over time. So power meters are a very, very worthwhile tool on a bike. Running pace on a track is suitable because it's a closed circuit, so it tends to alleviate wind direction and strength. Swimming pace in a pool is another one that can work, again because there's no currents or rips or the like. Heart rate, unfortunately, is too affected by other variables to be useful for high intensity interval training, as is speed on a bike. There's too many extraneous variables that impact upon its use. You need an output measure, not an input measure, for this to really be applicable. So understanding that intensity distribution is really important. 20% of your training volume can be high intensity as a rule of thumb. 80% can be low intensity. You need the low intensity in order to be able to train at the high intensity. Too much training at a moderate level or between VT2 and VT1 can leave the body feeling depleted, and therefore the individual cannot get through to high intensity. So it's a polarized model of training. Again, the accuracy of measurement is key. In cycling, we have to measure power because we do not have another equivalent. In running, you can use pace to a degree of success. In swimming, you can use swim speed to a degree of success to outline these variables. Measurement accuracy is really, really critical. So it's important to recognize that these three factors at the bottom here, Seeler has outlined as being well established, of good importance to endurance training needs. The frequency, how often, the volume, how much per week. High intensity interval training, making sure that a portion of your training volume each week involves accurate high intensity training, not too hard, not too easy. The training intensity distribution is important. In order to be able to train hard, you need to be able to train at low intensities such that you feel like you are able to hit the high intensities. That is of critical success. Total frequency, volume of training, high intensity training, and the training intensity distribution are very, very important for developing a strong basis in endurance training adaptation. Beyond this, we look at other factors up here. Tapering at the top, Seeler indicates it may be important, providing the aspects beneath it are done well. So marginal gains. Pacing strategy, again, marginal gains. Altitude training, heat training, energy availability, so you might be looking at glycogen depletion training, going out and exercising without glycogen stores. These can be very important, but there is a large amount of individual variance. So what works for some may not work for others. So again, you need to explore that in an environment where real measures are taken to see if that is actually working for you. Sports-specific training, which is further down the list. And micro-periodization. So looking at week-to-week periodization or month-to-month, there's a modest effect. So what we're talking about here is what your program may look like across a weekly cycle, across a monthly cycle. There is an effect there, but it's very modest, which is interesting. That leads us to the final point around general periodization. So what does your training plan look like across the year? Do you have a pre-season, a during season, a post-season? Most people do. These are usually outlined owing to the schedule of racing or competition, not necessarily for physiological purposes. What that means is the concept of base training into high intensity training, cycling back to base training, cycling back to high intensity training, when compared to adhering to a polarized model of training, doesn't appear to be a huge benefit to performance. So the annual training plan may be overrated. What is really important is the training intensity distribution, getting quality high intensity training, total frequency and volume of training. These appear to be the building blocks. General periodization, micro periodization has a far less effect. So periodization may be something that needs more understanding. It's something that's heavily used by athletes. Why is it heavily used? You could argue that it's to adhere to the racing calendar, not necessarily to what benefits the athlete from a physiological perspective. The question I would ask you, the audience here, or indeed others, is what about motivation and psychological aspects? If an athlete's poorly motivated, then they're going to need a periodization plan that allows them for rest and recuperation to get away from the rigors of training. They may need that at a micro periodization level as well to ensure that week to week, month to month, that they're getting a diversity of stimulus and recovery that enables them to stay motivated. So I do see this as a hierarchy of physiological needs that may not be taking into account psychological or social aspects of endurance training. So what is important? Just to recap, the total frequency. How often are you training? Is it 5 days a week? Is it 6 days a week? Write it down, commit to it. The total volume, how much? Important to look at your lifestyle factors to ensure that you don't burn out. Remember that you're going to be far stronger in 3 years' time than what you will be in 6 months of pushing yourself really hard. We're here for the long haul. So what is your total weekly volume? Is it 8 hours a week? Commit to that. Make sure it's a sensible goal. High intensity interval training, HIIT. Ensuring that you're training hard enough, but not too hard either. Where is the ceiling of your training intensity, and what is the floor of your training intensity for high intensity interval training? That needs to be measured and then programmed accordingly. The training intensity distribution. Training at high intensities and the rest at low intensities, with perhaps some moderate intensity or threshold intensity in there, is a nice intensity distribution that is backed by a lot of empirical research. Importantly, none of the above is really able to be executed well without accurate measurement, and there is a lot of inaccurate measurement. Utilizing a quality power meter for cycling is important. Also understanding what your running pace and swim speeds are in relation to intensity is a really important part of the process of getting this programming puzzle pieced together.